Well, I am so excited to have Dr. Looney here today. He is just one of my people. When I got to meet him at the Woodlands Church, it was like we just started preaching to each other, kind of is what
Yes.
happened. Somebody who has always struggled with addiction to food. I lost 100 pounds of learning to keep it off and having to deal with so much of that mindset stuff. When he shared something with me recently, it blew my mind, and I knew uh, a lot of us need to hear this. So, Dr. Paul, I had talked to you about talking about sabotage today and why, when we're making a move toward a change, why we often find ourselves sabotaging. And the first thing you did was correct me on the use of that word. And I want you to tell me why we're not going to use that word anymore.
Well, for me, Lindsay, and of course, everybody thinks about things in a way that works for them. But for me, I learned a few years ago that the word sabotage comes from the Netherlands, where when the peasants were being oppressed by the rich people who owned the grist mills, they would sometimes show their displeasure and kind of revolt by taking one of their wooden shoes, which is where the word sabbat comes from, and throw it into the gears of the grist mill and cause the windmill, to come to a grinding halt and tear up the gears and create a lot of damage. And it is true that sometimes the maybe the peasant part of us, the part of us that feels oppressed, does sometimes revolt and rebel against the other part of us. But I like to think that there are two aspects of why we slip or why we fail to keep going in pursuit of our goals. And one of them is because of discomfort. Whenever we move into some new territory, like the Israelites moving from Egypt to the promised land, there are obstacles that are scary to us, things that we haven't encountered before, things that are unfamiliar. And we sometimes back away from the unfamiliar just because it's uncomfortable. There's an old saying, Lindsay, that humans prefer the certainty of misery to the misery of uncertainty. And so sometimes we'd rather stick with what we know, even if we're miserable, because we're not miserable enough to risk the unknown. But the other reason I don't like the word is that I believe anytime we approach something that is healthy, that is transformational, that is godly or good, we have an enemy of our souls. And he is always trying to throw the shoe into the gears. He's always trying to sabotage and trying to derail us and to give us a reason to step back rather than stepping forward. And so although I think self-sabotage can be a useful thought, it's usually just our self-protection. Like we get scared of vulnerability, and so we step away from it. Ultimately, Jesus invites us to take up our cross daily, to daily recognize that, yes, this life of following Jesus means dying to those old parts of ourselves that were one time very useful, but now have served their purpose. And, when you and I talked, even in the matter of weight, people who turn to food especially as children, when they experience trauma or rejection or loneliness, whatever, it was powerfully effective and helpful for them to find a way to self-soothe themselves, especially if they didn't have people around them to soothe them, to comfort them, to tell them it's going to be okay. They had to find a way to take matters in their own hands and find comfort. And food, let's face it, there's a reason we call it comfort food.
Yeah, it is. And Paul, I want you to drill more into that when you were Egypt and moving toward the promised land. When you shared this image to me, this just changed everything in the way I look at what happens to most of us. Can you tell us more about that image and what that
Sure.
means for
Yeah,
us?
sure. So for me, Egypt is the place where God's people went in a time of famine when they were desperate. They felt their lives were threatened. Interestingly, it's also the place Jesus went when his life was threatened as a small child. And so I think of Egypt as the best the world has to offer. At the time, ancient world, Egypt was the pinnacle of warfare, literature, medicine, art. And so God uses the things that the world has for our good when we need them. But then later on, he asks us to step away from them. I like to use the word Egypt as an acrostic, which stands for everything that gets you past trauma. And
Wow.
so our coping strategies, our emotional defenses, food, alcohol, whatever it is that we turned to keep us going when we're dealing with grief and trauma, that's Egypt. And it's not all bad. It serves its purpose. And in some cases, like a child turning uh, to the internet for, community, or a boy looking at porn to give him some sense of grounding or comfort. Those things really do, in some cases, provide something that keeps us alive and going,
Yes.
keeps us from being crushed, because it gives
Sure.
us some sense that we control our environment. If you live in a household where you don't have much control emotionally or physically, you want to grab onto something, and that's where Egypt comes in. But we have to get miserable enough to move out. The misery of staying put has to exceed or get bigger than the misery of launching out. And that's when most of us reach for change. However, there are moments in our lives when we catch a glimpse of the promised land, we see something that is so powerfully appealing and good that it gives us the energy we need to take that step into the wilderness toward the promised land. And I don't know what your story was, whether it was the misery of, being sick and tired of being sick and tired, or some vision for your life that compelled you. It may have been a combination of both, but we need one or the other. We need a
Yes.
powerful vision of the promised land, or a
Both.
big reminder of the pain.
It's both, definitely. And what happens so often when we finally get that vision, we get a little bit of like a little tiny bit of hope that we can kind of start that direction, and you leave Egypt, you're leaving that comfortable place. Then what often happens to most of us, kind of in that, you called it the wilderness. That's when we're in the wilderness. And what happens there?
So in the wilderness, we've let go of the thing that has been our go-to, the thing that has been our comfort, the thing that has given us a sense of control. In the wilderness, you don't have that. Like, you're like, oh shoot, like, what now? You're living in a tent instead of living in a house, and you feel vulnerable, you feel exposed, and you feel very uncertain. Like, am I going to make this journey? And for the Israelites, they're like, you just brought us out here to kill us. Like, we're going to die. And,
That's how it
and you
feels.
exactly, because you don't have what you had, but you're certainly not to the promised land. And so that's when you need people around you to say, put one foot in front of another, do the next right thing, put your feet on the floor every morning, take a shower. Just those little things, those little steps that in the moment just take everything you've got. And it's we have to shift our view of ourselves. We have to die to that old view that I can't do this without food or sex or whatever. Like, I'm going to die if people don't like me, or, whatever the thing is. We have to go through withdrawal. And in the wilderness is where it happens. And it's dry, it's painful, and it's a slog, just one step at a time. And that's where, again, we have to remind ourselves, okay, like, yes, I missed some things about Egypt, but don't forget they were killing your kids, because, for some of us, we don't even have the energy to make the change for ourselves, but we can do it for love. And for the Israelites, when Pharaoh started killing their kids, it was like, okay, enough is enough. And when you see the results of your addiction hurting people that you love, that can be a powerful motivation. But you have to remind yourself, there's a reason I'm out here in this desert dying of thirst, because I don't want to go back to that old thing. And I choose to believe that God has something better if I just keep going.
That is so powerful. So what I hear you saying is, what we do in the wilderness when we feel tempted to go back to that place where we were, and we want to go back to that place of comfort, is reminding ourselves of the bad there, that they were killing your kids, you're dying, your kids are
Yeah.
being affected, your life is being affected. Another thing you said that really stuck out to me is you have to have somebody with you in the wilderness, like Moses was, to say, no, keep putting your feet on the ground, keep moving toward the promised land. And what is maybe another thing that you feel like people finding themselves in that place where they want to turn back around, but they don't really want to. They want to go forward,
Yeah.
but they just feel empowered, not that they can't do it. What would you say to that person to
Yeah.
keep them moving forward?
So grieving well is key because you used your addiction, your whatever it was you turned to, people pleasing, porn, food, whatever. You used that to avoid pain because the pain just seemed overwhelming. And as a child, it was. We didn't have the support, the tools, the emotional or spiritual maturity to deal with the pain. Now God is saying, like, Linsay, now you can walk through that pain without turning to something else. And the people that are with you can be with you in that pain and affirm it and say, sweetie, I know what you're going through is tough. I feel that with you. I know that pain. And so that validation, the comfort that you get by grieving well with people who can put their arms around you and can say, when you do have a slip and you eat a piece of cake or whatever, you call that person and say, I just had a piece of cake, instead of isolating and going into shame and eating the whole cake. Because that's where the enemy will get us if he can condemn us when we do take a step back. Because in the wilderness, you're gonna circle the mountain a few times. You're gonna go up and down and back and forth. But every step that you keep taking, as long as you don't go back to Egypt, is a step closer to the promised land. And you're dying, you're gradually dying to those impulses. And having compassion for yourself and realizing, like, of course you want to eat that cake. Of course you want to pig out. Somebody just was mean to you. Your spouse ignored you. Yes, you deserve to have a little comfort, but you deserve even more to die to that impulse so that you can have life to the full, which is not about filling yourself with something comfortable. It's about being the person who has the courage, the compassion, and the resilience to get back up.
Wow, this is so profound. I love this. So for all of us that find ourselves in the wilderness, what I hear Dr. Paul saying is first, just acknowledging that it is hard and that past served you for a time, but now it's no longer serving you. Surround yourself with people who can help you take that step and realize there's a grieving process and we're learning new ways of being that help us get to the promised land and actually experience the life that we really want. Like, this is so powerful. Thank you so much. Again, Dr. Paul is on YouTube. He is a board certified psychiatrist and he practices counseling individuals and couples that want to break free from destructive patterns. So you need to follow him on YouTube. I'll put the link below. Check him out on TikTok as well. It's brilliant and brings me so much joy. And thank you so much for being with me today. And I can't wait to hear more from you in the future. Great stuff.